The air in the small apartment was thick with the smell of fried plantain. Tolu, the eldest at 14, sat on the couch scrolling through his phone. His younger siblings, Saad and Femi, were on the floor, arguing over a piece of candy. Their mother, Mrs. Ajayi, moved quickly around the room, stuffing clothes into a suitcase. Their father stood near the door, checking his wristwatch. "We'll only be gone for a few weeks," their mother said, glancing at them. "You'll stay with Uncle Kunnel. He's family." Tolu's head snapped up. "Uncle Kunnel? I don't even know him." "He's your father's cousin," she replied. "You met him when you were little." "I don't remember," Saad mumbled, clutching her teddy bear. Femi, the youngest, wrinkled his nose. "Does he have Wi-Fi?" Their father sighed. "You kids worry too much. Kunnel is a good man. He'll take care of you." Something in his tone didn't sound convincing. Their parents had traveled before, but they usually left them with their grandmother. This time, Grandma had gone to the village. Uncle Kunnel was the only option. A loud honk sounded from outside. The taxi was here. Their mother kissed their foreheads, while their father patted their backs. "Behave yourselves," he said. "We'll call you when we land." As the door shut behind them, silence filled the apartment. Tolu exhaled. "So, when is this Uncle Kunnel coming?" A knock on the door made them all freeze. The knock came again, louder this time. Tolu exchanged glances with Saad and Femi. He got up slowly and opened the door. A tall man stood outside, dressed in a faded shirt and dark trousers. His face was lean, his eyes shadowed. He looked at them one by one before stepping inside without a word. "You must be Tolu," he finally said, his voice deep and dry. "And these are Saad and Femi." None of them answered. Uncle Kunnel scanned the small apartment. His eyes rested on their parents' wedding picture, then on the half-eaten food on the table. "Where are your things?" he asked. Tolu pointed at the bags their mother had packed earlier. "Good," Kunnel muttered. "Let's go." "Now?" Saad asked. "We haven't eaten dinner. You'll eat at my place." Something about his tone made Tolu uneasy, but he grabbed his bag anyway. They followed him downstairs to an old car parked by the road. Kunnel opened the front door and gestured for Tolu to sit beside him. Saad and Femi squeezed into the back. As the car moved, Tolu stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur into unfamiliar ones. "Where do you live, sir?" Saad finally asked. Kunnel glanced at her in the mirror. "A quiet place," he said. Nobody spoke after that. The drive felt longer than it should have. Tolu checked the time on his phone. 9:17 p.m. He knew their house was in Surulere, but they had passed Surulere a while ago. He leaned forward. "Uncle, where exactly do you stay?" Kunnel didn't answer immediately. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Not far," he said. Tolu swallowed. The roads were getting darker. Shops had closed. Most of the street lights flickered or didn't work at all. Saad shifted uncomfortably. "Are we still in Lagos?" Kunnel chuckled. "Where else would we be?" Tolu didn't find it funny. He had a bad feeling about this. He checked his phone, no signal. He glanced at Saad and Femi. They looked scared too. Kunnel made a sharp turn onto a narrow street. The road was rough, lined with old, broken houses. He finally stopped in front of a rusty gate. "We're here," he said. Tolu's stomach tightened. The house behind the gate was nothing like their own. It was old, paint peeling off the walls, the windows dark. It didn't look like a place anyone lived in. Kunnel unlocked the gate and pushed it open. "Come in." Femi hesitated. "Do you have Wi-Fi?" Kunnel gave a small smile, but his eyes remained cold. "No, you won't need it." Tolu grabbed Femi's hand and stepped inside. The moment he did, a strange feeling washed over him. The house felt heavy, like it was watching them. The living room had only a single chair and a wooden table. The TV was ancient, and a dusty clock hung on the wall. The air smelled damp. Kunnel dropped his keys. "Go inside. Your room is down the hall." Saad clutched her teddy bear. "Where's the bathroom?" Kunnel pointed to a door near the kitchen. "Use it before bedtime. I don't like movement at night." That sent a chill through Tolu's spine. They carried their bags down the dimly lit hallway. The room was small, with only one mattress on the floor. No bed frame, no curtains, just a single bulb flickering. "This place is weird," Saad whispered. Tolu nodded. "We need to be careful." Outside, Kunnel locked the front door with a loud click. The first night was rough. Femi tossed and turned on the mattress. Saad clutched her teddy bear tightly. Tolu lay awake, listening. The house made strange sounds, creaks, faint knocks, and something else. Breathing? At midnight, the sound of a door opening made Tolu freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He held his breath. The footsteps stopped outside their room. Then silence. After a long moment, they moved away. Tolu waited for what felt like hours before he finally let himself sleep. The next morning, at breakfast, Kunal was quiet. He placed 3 plates of plain rice on the table. No meat, no stew. "You will follow my rules," he finally said. "You don't ask questions. You don't enter my room. And you never, ever open the front door after dark." Femi blinked. "Why?" Kunal's eyes darkened. "Because I said so." No one argued. By afternoon, they started exploring. The house was bigger than it looked from outside. There were many doors, but most were locked. Tolu tried one near the kitchen. It didn't budge. "Leave it," Saad whispered. "Why are all these doors locked?" Tolu muttered. At dinner, Femi finally asked Kunal, "Uncle, what's behind the locked doors?" Kunal's fork froze midair. "Nothing that concerns you," he said sharply. Tolu noticed something. Kunal ate with only 1 spoon, 1 plate. No extra cups, no visitors. Did he live alone before they came? That night, Tolu stayed awake again. At exactly midnight, he heard it. A door creaking open. Tolu listened closely. The creaking came from down the hall. Then a soft whisper. It wasn't Kunal's voice. His heart pounded. He nudged Saad awake. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, eyes wide with fear. The whispering stopped. Then slow footsteps. Tolu's breath caught. Someone, or something, was moving in the hallway. Kunal had warned them not to leave the room at night. But why? The footsteps stopped outside their door again. A faint tapping followed. Tolu and Saad stayed still, gripping each other's hands. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound faded away. The next morning, Kunal acted normal, as if nothing happened. But Tolu knew something was wrong with this house. While sweeping the living room, Saad noticed the mirror hanging near the kitchen. It was dusty. She wiped it with her palm. For a second, she thought she saw someone behind her. She spun around. No one was there. Kunal entered the room. "What are you doing?" Saad hesitated. The mirror was dirty. Kunal's eyes darkened. "Don't touch it again." Saad nodded quickly and left. But when she glanced at the mirror one last time, her reflection was still there, even though she had already walked away. That evening, Kunal left the house for the first time. "I'll be back by 9. Don't open the door for anyone." As soon as he left, Femi grinned. "Let's watch TV." He turned it on. Static. Annoyed, he grabbed a ball and started playing indoors. Then it happened. He kicked the ball too hard. It hit the mirror near the kitchen. Crack. A long, thin fracture ran down the glass. Saad gasped. "Femi, what did you do?" Femi gulped. "Maybe he won't notice." Tolu wasn't sure. Because as they stared at the cracked mirror, a faint whisper rose in the room. The whisper grew louder. Tolu grabbed Femi's arm. "Turn off the TV." Femi obeyed, but the static sound continued. The crack in the mirror deepened, like something was pressing from the other side. Then a handprint appeared. Saad screamed. The whisper stopped instantly. The air grew heavy. Tolu dragged them away. "We need to fix this before Kunal comes back." But before they could do anything, they heard it. A key turning in the front door. Kunal was home. The front door swung open. Kunal stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Tolu quickly moved in front of the mirror, blocking the crack from view. Kunal set his keys on the table and glanced at them. "Why do you all look like you've seen a ghost?" Saad let out a nervous laugh. We were just watching TV." Kunal's eyes flickered to the remote. It was on the floor. The screen was blank. Tolu's heart pounded. Would he notice the mirror? Kunal walked past them slowly. He picked up his plate from breakfast, rinsed it, and dried his hands. Then, just as they thought they were safe, he stopped. His head turned slightly toward the mirror. Tolu held his breath. Kunal stared at the cracked glass for a long time. Then, without a word, he turned off the lights and walked to his room. As soon as his door shut, Saad whispered, "Did he see it?" Tolu swallowed. "I think he already knew it was there." The next night, Tolu had trouble sleeping again. Saad and Femi were fast asleep beside him, but he kept replaying the mirror incident in his head. Then, at exactly midnight, a noise made his eyes snap open. A door creaking. Not the front door. Not their bedroom door. One of the locked doors in the hallway. Tolu sat up slowly, straining to hear. Soft footsteps shuffled outside their room. His heart pounded. Who else was in this house? The footsteps faded. He wanted to check, but Cunnel's words echoed in his head. No movement at night. So he stayed still, his body stiff with fear, until morning. The next morning, while Cunnel was out again, Tolu searched the house. He needed to know what was behind those locked doors. In the living room, he found an old family album under a pile of newspapers. Dust covered its cover. Flipping through, he saw faded pictures of Cunnel when he was younger. Then he stopped at one. A man stood next to Cunnel. He looked just like him, but slightly different, taller, sharper features. Something felt off. Tolu flipped to the next page. But there were no more pictures. Just an empty space where a photo had been torn out. That evening, while washing plates, Saad felt a chill. The kitchen window was open, letting in the cool breeze. But that wasn't what made her uneasy. It was the feeling that someone was watching her. Then she heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost too soft to hear. Saad. She dropped the plate. It shattered on the floor. Femi rushed in. What happened? Saada's hands trembled. Someone called my name. Femi frowned. I didn't hear anything. Saad glanced at the cracked mirror in the living room. It wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was speaking to her. That night, the footsteps came again. But this time, they stopped outside their door longer. Tolu held his breath. The handle turned. The door didn't open. Cunnel had locked them in at night. But whoever was outside wanted in. Tolu felt Saada's grip tighten around his arm. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps faded. The next morning, when they woke up, something was lying outside their door. A single old shoe. At breakfast, Tolu decided to test Cunnel. Uncle, do you live alone? Cunnel looked up sharply. Yes. Has anyone else lived here before? Cunnel's jaw clenched. He took a long sip of water before answering. This is my house. Always has been. Femi, completely unaware of the tension, blurted out. Then whose shoe was outside our door? Cunnel's spoon clattered against his plate. Tolu felt the air grow cold. Cunnel's voice was dangerously low. You kids ask too many questions. Nobody spoke after that. Later that day, while Cunnel was napping, Femi needed the bathroom. Saad took him. But as they walked past the hallway, Saad stopped. A door that had always been locked was slightly open. Darkness stretched inside. Femi tugged her hand. Come on, I need to pee. Saad took one step closer. A cold breeze touched her skin. Then, inside the dark room, a shadow moved. She grabbed Femi and ran. That night, Saad heard the voice again. But this time it was louder. Saad. She sat up, breathing hard. The whisper was coming from the mirror. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the voice didn't stop. Saad, please help me. Then, something pressed against the glass from inside. She opened her eyes. A face stared back at her. Not her own. The next day, Tolu made a decision. He needed to get inside one of those locked rooms. Cunnel always carried his keys, but that evening, when he stepped into the bathroom, he left them on the table. Tolu moved fast. He grabbed the keychain and signaled to Saad. They tiptoed toward the hallway. But just as they reached the locked door, Cunnel's voice boomed. What do you think you're doing? Tolu spun around. Cunnel stood there, watching. Cunnel didn't punish them. But the next morning, something changed. The locks on the doors were gone. Every door in the hallway now stood slightly open, as if waiting for them. Tolu felt a cold shiver down his spine. Cunnel hadn't removed the locks. Something else had. And whatever it was, wanted them to come inside. Tolu's heart pounded as he stepped into the dimly lit room. Dust coated the wooden floor, and the air felt thick and stale, like no one had stepped inside for years. His flashlight flickered, barely pushing back the darkness. Saad and Femi lingered at the doorway. Hurry up, Saad whispered, glancing nervously behind her. Tolu took another step forward. In the center of the room sat a lone wooden chair, its legs uneven, its frame splintered. It looked as if someone had been sitting there for decades, and then vanished. Something shifted in the shadows. Tolu froze. Two glowing eyes stared at him from the far end of the room. They were low to the ground at first, then slowly rose higher and higher, as if something was standing up from the darkness. The flashlight trembled in Tolu's grip. He tried to speak, to warn Saad and Femi, but no sound left his throat. Then a whisper slithered through the stale air. Why did you come here? Tolu took a slow, shaky step backward. The eyes did not blink. They did not move. Then they vanished. Tolu turned and ran. Tolu slammed the door shut, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He pressed his back against the wood, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Sod grabbed his arm. What did you see? Tolu shook his head, unable to form the words. He didn't have to. Femi had already begun to cry. Then, from behind the door, the whispers began. Soft at first, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. Then louder. Leave. 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 Sada's grip on Femi tightened. Tolu stared at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. Bang. The force of it shook the walls. Sad screamed. Femi clung to her, burying his face in her stomach. Another bang came, louder this time. Tolu gritted his teeth and reached for the handle, ready to run. Then silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the hallway light flickered. The doorknob rattled. A voice too deep to be Cunnell's whispered. I see you. They ran. They barely made it back to their room before they heard Uncle Cunnell's heavy footsteps. The whispers stopped instantly. The doorknob rattled again. This time it was Cunnell's voice. Open this door. Tolu hesitated, then slowly unlocked it. Cunnell stood in the doorway, his face blank, but his eyes burned with something unreadable. You touched the door, didn't you? His voice was calm, too calm. Sod swallowed. We got lost, she lied. Cunnell said nothing. His gaze lingered on Tolu for a moment before he stepped back and shut the door. A second later, they heard it, a metallic click. He had locked them inside. The room fell into silence. The only sound was their own breathing. Femi sat on the bed, knees pulled to his chest. He's mad at us, he mumbled. Tolu ignored him. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. He expected to hear Cunnell's footsteps walking away. Instead, he heard something else. A soft scraping sound. Slow, steady, like nails dragging across the floor. Tolu stepped back, his hands clammy. The sound grew louder, closer. It stopped right outside their door. Then came the whisper. You should have left. Tolu yanked Sod and Femi back. The whisper had no source, no voice. Then something brushed against the bottom of the door. A shadow, long and distorted, slipped underneath the gap. The morning came, but something felt different. The air inside the house was thicker. The walls felt closer. When Cunnell finally unlocked their door, his face was unreadable. He carried a tray of food, plain rice and water. He set it down without a word and turned to leave. Tolu studied him, his mind racing. Did Cunnell know what happened last night? Then Tolu's eyes fell to the floor, and his stomach turned cold. Cunnell's shadow stretched across the room, longer than it should have been. It bent at odd angles. It moved a second too late whenever Cunnell shifted, like it didn't belong to him at all. Sod had had enough. She grabbed Tolu's arm. We need to leave. They ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Then Sod rushed to a window, ready to pry it open. But when she reached for it, her fingers hit solid concrete. The window was gone. The wall was smooth, seamless, as if a window had never existed there. Sod took a step back, her breath uneven. No, this isn't right. Femi clutched her hand. Sod, what's happening? She had no answer. That night, Sod heard movement downstairs. She peeked out of their room. The kitchen light flickered. The fridge door was wide open. Someone, something, stood in front of it. At first, she thought it was Cunnell, but then she saw its arms. Too long, fingers bending backward. The fridge door slowly shut. The figure turned toward her. Sod slammed the door and held her breath. Footsteps moved toward the stairs. Then they stopped. The thing never came up. Femi screamed in his sleep. Sod shook him awake. Femi, wake up. His eyes snapped open. His small hands gripped her wrist, shaking. I saw a face, he whispered. Sod frowned. Where? Femi's lip trembled. He slowly raised a finger, pointing at the ceiling. Sod looked up. Nothing was there, but the ceiling fan wasn't spinning anymore. It had stopped, in the shape of a twisted smile. Tolu counted the doors in the hallway. He had to make sure he wasn't losing his mind. There were 6. Yesterday there had been 5. He stepped back, his breath quickening. Was he imagining things? Or was the house itself playing tricks on him? He tried the door to his left. It was locked. But why hadn't it been locked last night? Sod walked up behind him. What's wrong? Tolu ran his fingers through his hair. There's a new door, Sod. She glanced over at the other doorways. She counted. She shook her head, confused. There had always been 5. Femi appeared at the end of the hallway, his eyes wide and frightened. Where's the door to the kitchen? Tolu turned, his stomach dropping. The kitchen door was now gone. In its place was a wall, solid and impenetrable. The house was changing. Saad wandered into the living room, hoping the change in the hallway had just been a mistake. But the sight before her made her skin crawl. There was an old photograph of Kunal hanging on the wall. Saad had seen it before. Kunal had been standing alone, smiling in an old-fashioned way. It looked like a photo from years ago, long before they'd ever arrived. But now, a tall, shadowy figure stood beside him. Saad took a step closer, heart racing. The figure was faint, almost indistinguishable, but it had the same angular build as Kunal. Its eyes were blacker than the rest of the shadows in the room. She blinked. The photo was just a blur again, Kunal standing alone. But she swore she saw the figure move, even if only for a split second. The house seemed colder than before. They'd only been upstairs for a few minutes, but when Tolu went back down to check on Femi, he wasn't there. Femi, Tolu called, running through the hallway. He checked every room. Nothing. The kitchen was dark. The walls seemed to stretch, pulling back, like the house was breathing, shifting in and out. Saad and Tolu ran through the house, shouting his name. But the house was silent. Then came the whisper, not loud, but unmistakable. "I know where he is." It came from somewhere far away, somewhere deep inside the house. Tolu and Saad ran to the living room. In the corner, something strange caught Saada's eye, a rug oddly bunched up, as if someone had dragged it. She moved it aside, revealing a small trapdoor in the floor. It was old and rusted, with a small iron ring at the center. The moment she touched it, a deep groan reverberated through the house. Tolu stepped forward. "What's this?" Saad pulled at the ring, but the door didn't budge. Femi's voice came from below. "Help me." The floor beneath them felt alive, pulsing, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Tolu grabbed the handle with both hands, yanking it open. A ladder descended into darkness. Tolu hesitated. The air smelled damp and moldy, and the chill sent a shiver down his spine. But he had to find Femi. Saada's grip on his arm was tight. "Be careful." He nodded and began climbing down the ladder. The dark was almost suffocating. When his feet finally hit the ground, the smell hit him first, something old, something rotten. Then, in the faint glow of the flashlight, he saw him. Femi was curled in a corner, his body shaking. His wide eyes locked onto Tolu, but there was no recognition in them, only pure fear. Tolu rushed over, kneeling beside him. "Femi, are you okay?" But Femi only whispered, "It's too late." Femi didn't speak for a long time. Saad sat beside him, her face pale, her voice trembling. "What happened down here?" Femi slowly shook his head. He glanced over at Tolu. "Uncle Kunal, he brought me here." Tolu froze. "What do you mean?" Femi didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted around the room. It felt like the walls were closing in on them. "Uncle Kunal isn't who he says he is," Femi whispered. "He brought me to this place." Tolu's mind raced. He couldn't process what Femi was saying, but he felt it deep in his gut. Kunal had never been right. He had always been too calm, too distant. But to hear Femi say this, was Kunal hiding something more sinister? Tolu's eyes scanned the stone walls. It was cold down here, unnervingly so. But what he saw made his blood run cold. There were names scratched into the wall, hundreds of them, written in uneven handwriting. Some of the names were half erased, as if someone had tried to scrub them away. Tolu ran his fingers over one of the names. His breath caught in his throat. It read, Kunal Adisa, 1995. He took a step back, his mind racing. Kunal wasn't. He wasn't a normal person. What had he done? What was he hiding? Saad ran her fingers over the next name. The name beside Kunal's was another, older. Adisa Okafor, 1948. They heard the heavy footsteps upstairs, the sound of Kunal's shoes against the floor. But when they reached the living room, he was already standing there. Kunal's face was calm, almost serene. But his eyes had changed. His pupils were too wide, his gaze too focused. Tolu stepped back, glancing over at Saad. Her face mirrored his fear. Kunal stood still, silent. He wasn't moving. It was as if his presence had solidified the space. But then, his shadow didn't move with him. It twisted, stretched, and warped. It did not belong to Kunal. The man standing before them was not their uncle. Saad screamed, "Run!" Tolu yanked Femi's hand. They dashed toward the door, but the house fought back. The air thickened. The walls pressed in. The floor shifted beneath them. Kunal spoke in a low, guttural voice, his words too twisted to understand. "You can't leave. Not now." Talou ran faster, the door just in reach. He pulled it open, only to find another wall standing in its place. There was no escape. The house groaned, its floorboards creaking with unnatural weight. The walls seemed to pulse like a living being. Every door, every window was locked tight. The house was closing in. Then, with a sickening lurch, Femi was pulled back. Saad screamed. Talou reached out, but Femi was dragged deeper into the house, his cries fading into the darkness. They were losing him. A loud knock echoed from the front door. Sada's hand trembled as she grabbed the knob and opened it slowly. Standing there, alive, was Kunnal. His face was soft, kind, and real. He looked the same as he always had, except for his eyes. His pupils were normal. He wasn't glowing. He wasn't stretching. "Let me in," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with urgency. The children turned, frozen, staring at Kunnal in the doorway. The Kunnal inside the house began to melt. His form distorted, stretching. His face twisted into something unrecognizable. "You were never supposed to come here," the real Kunnal said. Before they could react, the house groaned again. It was pulling them in. To be continued. Will Kunnal harm the children? Stay tuned for part 2.